Welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council with hosts Grace Evans and Moses Brattrud. Stay informed on the top stories on life, family, and religious freedom. Get the facts, stand for truth. Hello and welcome to the Family Beacon podcast. My name is Grace Evans. I'm here with Moses Brattrud. Today we have a lot of things to cover on the podcast. Let me give you a quick rundown and then we will jump into our very first story. So first, Moses is going to tell us about how Minnesota is currently in the midst of a population collapse. I will be discussing a Joe Rigney article on World about Apple's new environmentalism ad and how Christians need to take note of what's going on with that ad. Our next story is actually going to be about how former President Donald Trump is wavering on abortion and gender, and so we'll give you a rundown of his recent comments on both of those issues. Then, of course, we will close with a verse. So, Moses, go ahead and take us away with our very first story about how population is collapsing here in Minnesota.
Sure. So this is a report, and I should say this is a little bit of a different thing from what we are normally covering on the podcast, right? You know, we're normally talking about social issues, what the Minnesota legislature is doing, what the pro-life movement is doing, things like that. However, it's really important for us as Christians and as Minnesotans to think and care about what's going on in our state. You know, other than that, outside of our immediate realms of interest, outside of our churches and our schools and our political battles. And this is also an issue that's very nonpartisan. One party didn't cause this problem. One party is not going to fix this problem. There's really concerning information in a new report that's been released for anyone who cares about the future of our state. So we wanted to take a little time to talk about that. Now, this report is called Minnesota's Vanishing Workforce, and it was released by a couple Minnesota-based businesses and nonprofits, and it was actually prepared by my old employer, an economics firm called Lightcast. So that's how it came to my attention. But looking through this and seeing that, you know, it's the chairman of the board and CEO of General Mills who's writing the introduction of this report, this is something that, you know, that's one of the largest Minnesota-based businesses. People in Minnesota need to care about and need to understand in more depth because it will affect the future of our state. So let me give you the high-level overview. Basically, we're talking about Minnesota's workforce, and that's the number of people who are currently working or looking for work. And that, and unfortunately, the workforce in Minnesota has not recovered to where it would have been if the pandemic had not hit in 2020. So as of June 2023, the state still needs 23,000 more people in the labor force to get back to its February 2020 level. Now, if you take into account the absence of the pandemic effect, we're missing roughly 168,000 workers. So that's really bad.
Wow.
So that's 5.4% below where we would have been, arguably. There are various causes and effects here, right? But that's probably 5.4% below where we would have been had the pandemic not affected us, whereas the U.S. as a whole is only 1.5% below where it presumably would have been if the pandemic had not hit. So we have some serious catching up to do. National employment has caught up to where it was before the pandemic and surpassed it, but Minnesota is still lagging behind. So another factor here is the labor force participation rate. So that is a big, kind of a big mouthful of words. What does that actually mean? So it's the number of adults or the percentage of adults who are engaged in work. I think it probably is, I don't have this in front of me, but I think it's probably identified as adults who are ages 20 and above. I'm pretty sure that's true. So if you're 18 or 19, you're not counted. It's adults 20 and above, or rather 20, maybe between 20 and 65. So it's not all adults. So we're looking at all adults, and the rate of labor force participation is 4.6% below the U.S. average.
Wow.
So that, and that, you know, it's so abstract to talk about these percentages, but it's basically, and this makes it more concrete, it's talking about an absence from the workforce of 325,000 people,
Mm.
which is insane. Just imagine. And another thing this report says is that in Minnesota, we have an extremely tight labor market. There's more than one job posting for every unemployed person out there. In other words, companies are really struggling to attract talent. And that's something I'll talk about in a second. And that makes it extremely hard for that business to do business because they're trying to grow. They have customers that need things. And when you're not able to hire for positions, you're not able to actually fulfill those orders, grow your balance sheet, grow your company, and be productive. So it's extremely worrisome that Minnesotans are falling out of the workforce. Now, it also may be surprising that after COVID, retiring baby boomers is the absolute biggest thing here that's causing this. But they're already starting to age out of the workforce. We're not expecting them to keep working past age 65 or whatever. But what we're seeing in addition to all these retirements from the baby boomers, which are this huge generation, is this decline is especially steep among young people, ages 20 to 24, who are not working, and prime working age men between 25 and 54. So those are people who are generally old enough that they're out of college or other schooling, and young enough, 54, that they're not yet at retirement age. And it's those people who are not in the workforce. Now, this problem is compounded, Grace, by a problem that we've talked about many times, which is Minnesota's fertility rate.
Mm-hmm.
And now the fertility rate has been below the replacement rate since 2009. So that was the point, 2009, when we started having fewer babies than we need to just replace our population. That's the number is 2.1 children per woman. Now the birth rate has gone from 1.95 children per woman in 2011 all the way down to 1.75 in 2021. And that equates to a loss of 285,000 people, about 5% of the state's population. Now,
wow,
that's over a 10-year period, Grace. And I did a little calculating. This is not an apples to apples comparison. But I did want to think about how abortion fits into this. The report does not talk about this, but abortion is a scourge of our state. And it is killing people. It is hurting women. But one of the other things it does is it actually hurts our society as a whole. It hurts our economy. And that is less important, to be sure, than the fact that it's murder, right? But the abortion rate has been about relatively steady at about 10,000 abortions per year for the last 10 years, at least so far as the state's Department of Health is to be believed. So if you take those 285,000 missing babies over the last 10 years, between 2011 to 2021, you can add on to that 100,000 more babies lost to abortion. So we're talking about 385,000.
Wow.
Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that without abortion, that would be that shortfall of almost 300,000 workers or future workers, Minnesotans, their babies now, their kids now, because the people born between 2011 and 2021, that would be reduced by almost a third, that shortfall. So I want to bring this in for a landing. I don't want to spend the whole podcast talking about this. But basically, another factor here is people moving out of the state. 19,000 or so people moved out of Minnesota in 2022. And just a few years ago, people were moving into Minnesota at higher levels. So there have been a couple developments. If you put this all together, it's bad news for our economy. And that is bad news for our state as a whole. And there's all sorts of things we can do. But I think the first thing people need to understand is that there is a problem. So I think people are kind of like, we've talked in the podcast before about ignoring the demographic problem, just really putting your fingers in your ears and singing la, 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 and pretending that we're having enough babies when we're not. And that is going to cause our economy to, eventually contract in either small ways or in major ways. And that has yet to be determined. So these are problems generally that, yes, are being seen in other states. Minnesota is seeing this almost the worst of any state, especially any state outside of like the Northeast, Massachusetts, New York, states like that. So That's what I wanted to bring to people's attention today. I hope it wasn't boring. I hope that people see how important this is to keep tabs on. These are facts that we need to come to terms with and then act on. Now, coming from a completely different place, Grace, is this article about environmentalism, about sort of the neo-pagan environment that we live in. Joe Rigney, your old college president at Bethlehem College, he's writing about this. What is his main point here?
Yeah, absolutely, Moses. And first of all, I want to ask you, have you seen Apple's new commercial about Mother Nature?
No, I didn't have time to. Okay. I didn't have time, so tell me about it.
Yeah, I'll tell our audience about it. If you Google Mother Nature Apple ad, you guys can find it. We won't roll it in the podcast for the sake of time because it's about 4 minutes long, but I'll summarize it.
I'm sorry, but what a drag.
Well, I want to summarize it for you because my old president and college professor thinks that this is actually worth taking a look at, and he thinks it actually is kind of good in some sense, and he lists 4 ways why it's kind of a good thing that Apple put out this ad. So I want to explain those to you. First, let me recap that ad quickly for you. So Apple just dropped it, and it's basically a group of Apple employees. They're sitting around a conference room table, and they're nervously awaiting for Mother Nature to drop by for her annual corporate responsibility review. And so that's basically the setting, and Mother Nature comes into the scene, and she's pretty frustrated because she's like, Apple's probably not doing enough for the environment. They're probably going to make all these promises that things are going to change in 10 or 20 years, but nothing really is going to change because that's what all the other corporations do. But she's pleasantly surprised that Apple actually is doing a great job on environmentalism. So that's just a brief recap of it, but I want to just help make those points, reiterate those points that Joe made in his article about why this ad really helps Christians take note of the increasing clarity of the neo-pagans. His very first point is that we can appreciate that the ad provides manifest evidence that Christians don't have a monopoly on cringe-inducing religious propaganda, which is so funny and so true. I mean, you guys probably are very aware of the many different videos, the many different movies that have come out by Christian studios. Not that they're all bad by any means, but a lot of them are very cringy, just not high quality, and are very overtly religious, which not necessarily wrong, but usually pretty cringy. And Joe is pointing out here that, hey, the pagans can actually make really cringy content too. I mean, I laughed so much during this. His second point is that we really need to appreciate how overt those religious themes are in the ad. These humans, these Apple workers, are sacrificing and performing these good works in order to appease this angry deity of Mother Nature. They are so afraid of her, getting everything ready, barely breathing, and yet there's this sense of they love being in her presence because she's a deity and they want to please her. So after they leave, after Mother Nature leaves, one of the employees sighs, "Wow, that was awesome." And all she did the whole time was kind of yell at them, be upset with them because she thought they weren't doing enough. So Joe says that modern neo-paganism has rarely been as well represented in a short video. He says, quote, "I half expected one of the employees to slaughter a ram on top of an altar of MacBook Pros," which is hilarious. And it's so, so true. He says also, quote, "The divinization of nature, the condemnation of religious hypocrisy, the works of supererogation, the appeasement of the goddess, all of these underscore that beneath many of our public policy debates are fundamental religious differences about the nature of God, sin, humanity, and atonement." And that there, I think, is a great point of this video just really makes this environmentalism debate religious. It is. People on both sides of the aisle have religious leanings, and environmentalism is actually innately religious, and this video does a great job of showing that. The third point that Joe makes in this article on World is that it's really interesting that Apple chose Octavia Spencer to play Mother Nature because she actually played Papa in the Shaq movie adaptation 6 years ago, and Papa is the author's depiction of God, the Father, as a black woman. So when Apple chose Spencer to portray this ad after she already acted in the shack, we can just see this almost sense of humor. And Joe says it's the attempted feminization of the Christian God that is now degenerating into the cult of the divine feminine. So I think that just adds
this
to the
woman, this actress has
Mhm.
now appeared in 2 extremely cringy religious type of videos. One of them a Christian supposedly movie where a woman plays God the Father, and now this Apple ad where she's playing Mother Nature. So she's crossing the border from one type of religious cringe to another.
That's right. And it's not just her. I mean, it's Apple that just reinforces Apple's cringy neo-paganism themes that actually, again, are worth taking note of for the Christian. And actually, it's kind of a good thing for us, Joe is arguing. The fourth point that he makes, and the final point, is that we should consider the subtle differences in how the sexes are being treated in this. And actually, I think it's pretty blatant. Joe says it's subtle, but I think it's blatant. Throughout the whole entire video, Mother Nature, she dismisses everyone at the table, all of the corporate executives, but she's especially malignant towards all of the male executives. Tim Cook has a weather joke, and that's met with darkening skies, with thunder. There's a man that sits in a leather jacket at the table, and he's singled out by Mother Nature for violating her sacred cows. And there's also a man who gets really excited about carbon neutrality, like overexcited about it. And he's just totally disregarded by Mother Nature, and a female colleague has to help him out and change the subject. And so you just see that.
Okay,
go ahead.
If I could just enter into the video for a second. How dumb do you have to be to wear a leather jacket to a meeting with the goddess Mother Nature, who could presumably, in this fictional scenario, strike you down for having participated, not directly, but indirectly, in the killing of a cow? I mean, that's pretty stupid. I think Apple should get rid of that guy.
I am weak. Anyways, it's back on this train of thought, the point that Joe's making about how the sexes are portrayed. It's at the end of this whole skit, it is only a woman who approaches the, quote, throne of Mother Nature, Joe says with confidence, unflinching and composed in the face of the goddess's withering questions. She is a priestess in the new religion. And it's so funny because the whole skit ends with one of the characters making a final peace offering of a carbon neutral Apple Watch and assuring that Apple will be carbon neutral by, I think, 2030. So in conclusion, all of those points just go towards Joe's main point, which is that this video truly outlines this new environmental religion that really permeates our world. It's complete with deities, with offerings, with works of penance, with priestesses even. And he says, quote, while we ought to resist its spread with the zeal of the prophet Elijah, we should also be grateful when the opposition shows itself clearly. And more than that, we ought to be grateful that in contrast to the indifference and disappointment of Mother Nature, Christians offer good news of a loving Father who welcomes sinners who come to him in the name of the Son. And I think that's a great response to that ad. I hadn't seen it before I read Joe's article. And I think that it's, like he says, it's very, very helpful for us in the culture war when the opposition reveals themselves so clearly like this. We even saw that here in Minnesota with the last session in 2023. I mean, we had some pretty brutal laws passed, some pretty awful laws, but one thing we were grateful for is the opposition was showing its true colors. They didn't hold anything back. Even with the PRO Act, we saw every single Democrat vote in favor of leaving infants born alive from botched abortions on the operating table and having no regulations for requiring those infants to be treated with life-saving measures. And so when that happened and when many other laws were passed, when other debates were happening, we really saw the opposition being very obvious and very, very clear in what it stands for. And I think we should be grateful when that happens. And like Joe says, ultimately, we're grateful that we don't serve Mother Nature, we serve Christ. And so loved that article. We will have that linked down below in the show notes for you guys. Moses, let's now turn, unless you have thoughts on this. If you have thoughts, feel free to share them.
I'll say one thing. Yeah, like I think Joe's article sounds really good. I'm bummed that I didn't
Mm-hmm.
get a chance to read it before our show, so I definitely will now. But I just think, like, I'll just be the left leaning person for a moment
Mm-hmm.
here, which is not the hat that I usually have on. But as Christians, we do have good reasons to care for the world that we live in. It's been
Mm-hmm.
given to us by God as a gift. We are the rulers. We've been placed in charge. And so, no, we should not be strip mining the earth for all its resources and killing the endangered species. And we should respect those things and try to respect the world that's been given to us as a gift. Now, does that mean we should stop developing countries from burning coal because it would lower carbon emissions, but it would also send their economies back to the pre-industrial ages? No, I think that's stupid. Now that we have, as a world, now that our race is in a position where there's so much wealth and so much what's the word I want? Output and consumption. It
Privilege.
is kind of well, right. It's a luxury for people to come in and say, okay, now that we're Apple, the richest company in the world, and let's ignore the fact that we have factories in China that the working conditions are so dire that there's suicide nets outside the buildings so that the workers don't jump. Okay, like, let's ignore all of that, but let's just pretend that Apple can somehow get points for being good about nature. But we as Christians can, I think, coming from a bit of a different place, we can say, because we love God, because God has given this world to us, we should live respectfully here in the place that we've
Absolutely.
been given. Not
Absolutely,
treating it
Moses.
like a deity, as I think Joe is absolutely right. It's so, of course, absurd. And you're so right to point that out. It's absurd when we talk about nature as a deity, Mother
Mm-hmm.
Nature. The earth is not our mother. No, the church is our mother. Okay. Okay. I'll get off that. I'll get off that tangent. But thank you so much for sharing that, Grace. And now I did want to talk with you about these new clips from Donald Trump. So
Mm-hmm.
in the past week, Donald Trump has given at least 2 major interviews. One with NBC's Meet the Press, and that was posted on September 17th. And then another interview with journalist Megyn Kelly on her YouTube channel that was posted September 14th. So in the interview from Meet the Press, which actually came out after, but we'll talk about it first, he's talking about abortion. And in the second interview with Megyn Kelly, he talks a little bit about the transgender issue. So, why are we talking about this? Donald Trump isn't president. He's just running for president. Why aren't we talking about the other Republican candidates? Well, we certainly would talk about the other Republican candidates. But I think at this point, it's we're looking at some facts. So, Donald Trump is by far the front runner in the Republican primary. Anything could happen that would prevent him from taking the nomination next year, because we're talking about things that are happening next year, right? But at this point, it looks very likely that we're going to see a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And if we do see that, right now, the polls right now are a statistical tie between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So we could be looking at a very close race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, just like we saw 3 years ago. Do we want that? No. Is that the best idea? No. In fact, I saw a poll, Grace, this week. 64% of voters say a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden would make them feel that the American political system is broken. But it's sort of like we're lurching towards this thing, and any people in the Democratic primary voters and Republican primary voters are the people who can say, okay, you know what? It's time for something different. We can toss out Joe Biden. We can toss out Donald Trump. We can get somebody presumably younger, certainly better. And yet it doesn't look likely that voters on either side are going to do that unless they're forced to by circumstances such as, God forbid, either of those elderly leaders having a huge health scare that prevents them from continuing to run. Okay, so disclaimer, we're not talking about Trump's stances here to tell you that Trump is worse than any other candidate or better. We're telling you so that you can think and pray about who you support and who will have your vote in the Republican primary, and so that you can stay informed if you are voting in the Republican primary. And so at this point, we're going to roll his clip on abortion from NBC's Meet the Press.
I want to know what you're going to do if you're
We are going to
would
come
you sign
together.
federal legislation that would ban abortion at 15 weeks?
No, let me just tell you what I do. I'm going to come together with all groups, and we're going to have something that's acceptable. Right now, to my way of thinking, the Democrats are the radicals, because after 4 and 5 and 6 months, but you have to say this, after birth. You have New York State and other places that pass legislation where you're allowed to kill the baby after birth.
Mr. President, I want to give voters who are going to be weighing in on this election a very clear sense of where you stand on this.
I think they're all going to like me. I think both sides are going to like me.
What's going to
have to happen is you're going to have to, Kristen, you're asking me a question. What's going to happen is you're going to come up with a number of weeks or months. You're going to come up with a number that's going to make people happy, because 92% of the Democrats don't want to see abortion after a certain period of time.
If a federal ban landed on your desk, if you were reelected, would you sign it at 15
weeks? Are you
weeks?
talking about a complete ban?
A ban at 15 weeks.
Well, people are starting to think of 15 weeks. That seems to be a number that people are talking about right now.
Would you sign that?
I would sit down with both sides and I'd negotiate something, and we'll end up with peace on that issue for the first time in 52 years. I'm not going to say I would or I wouldn't. I mean, DeSantis is willing to sign a 5-week and 6-week ban.
Would you support that? You think that goes too far?
I think what he did is a terrible thing and a terrible mistake. But we'll come up with a number. But at the same time, Democrats won't be able to go out in 6 months, 7 months, 8 months and allow an abortion. And Kristen, you have to look at this because you said no.
So, Grace, there are a couple things that I think are really important that Donald Trump says there, possibly changes to his position. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this on the podcast. I think that, Trump does hit the Democratic Party, Democratic candidates pretty hard for no limits on abortion, and that's something certainly to be applauded. But I don't think his personal stance is strong enough at all. I mean, life begins at conception, and he goes after some strong pro-life candidates, such as DeSantis specifically, who, of course, as was mentioned in the video, banned abortions 5 and 6 weeks. After 5 and 6 weeks. And I think that's an amazing piece of legislation that Governor DeSantis pushed, and other pro-life governors have pushed legislation such as that. And I think that, former President Trump called that 6-week ban a terrible thing and a terrible mistake. And that is a terrible statement. I mean, there's nothing terrible and there is no mistake about saving lives. I mean, think how many innocent and beautiful children are saved by that sort of a ban. He ultimately just refuses to commit to any sort of a federal ban. He says that he, quote, as you guys heard, would sit down with both sides and negotiate something, and that we'll end up with peace on this issue. And here's the bottom line, President Trump. There is going to be no peace where there is murder of innocent children involved. I mean, unless you end the murder of children, there is going to be injustice. There is going to be chaos. We can't have peace while the most innocent and the most marginalized continue to be oppressed in our country. And so I think that, he goes further than some candidates and certainly is much more pro-life than President Biden. But there is a lot of room for him to be much more strongly pro-life. I think that he honestly was fairly weak in this response. Grateful for him hitting Democrats hard on their no limits on abortion, but I think that he ought to. It's a very logical thing for him to commit to some sort of federal ban. So those are my thoughts on that, Moses. Do you have thoughts? And then I also want to hear your thoughts on what he said on gender.
Yeah, Grace, I think you're absolutely right. We understand why candidates are moderating their position on abortion. We've seen what's happened in bluish and purplish states since Dobbs came down. We've seen it in Minnesota, and we've talked about it, but it's also happening in other states. This sort of groundswell of pro-abortion support that probably has never been seen before and possibly will never be seen again, but was just raised by the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So politicians are scared. And unfortunately, I think, in my view, that's what's happening here with Donald Trump. He's scared that pro-abortion voters are going to rebuke him for anything pro-life that he says. And, he's someone that I think we know is a pragmatic person rather than a principle-driven person. And for some people, that's why they admire him, right? But unfortunately, that means on these strong moral issues, there's a lot to be desired, and that's sad to say. And yet we say that while also appreciating how he calls out Democratic politicians who are very rarely or never asked these hard questions about abortion in the press, or if they're very rarely pushed. And you can look this up and try to find clips of it. They're very rarely pushed on whether they actually support abortion all the way up through birth, because many of them are extremely unwilling to answer that question.
Right.
Okay. So now, as you said, this other clip from Megyn Kelly's YouTube channel is interesting. So let's roll that now.
What about the children? That's become an issue now. Should children be provided with access to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones when they're minors?
Yeah, I'm so against it. First of all, many of them, I heard like 62%, when they grow up, when they're older, they're saying, who did this to me? Why did you do this to me? Second of all, the parents have to make the decision. They're trying to give it to school boards and schools and things to make a decision. It's unbelievable to think, I talk about mutilation sometimes in my speeches. We will stop the mutilation of children. And then I'll stop and I'll say to the people in the audience, I'll say, can you imagine that I'm talking about we're going to stop mutilation of children? Yeah. But that's what it is. It's the mutilation of children. And we will stop the mutilation of children. 10 years ago, nobody would ever think of it. I am telling people, because I guess I'm a politician, whether I like it or not. As a politician, as somebody that represents a lot of people, I'm telling people that we're going to stop the mutilation of children. Who would have to say a thing like that? You'd think it would be automatic.
Would you be in favor of a ban then on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors?
I think yes. Yep. I would.
Can a man become a woman?
In my opinion, you have a man, you have a woman. I think part of it is birth. Can the man give birth? No, although they'll come up with some answer to that also someday. I heard just the other day they have a way that now the man can give birth. No, I would say I'll continue my stance on that.
So I think it's fair to say that former President Trump comes out stronger on the gender issue, certainly, than on the abortion issue. He starts out in response to Megyn Kelly's question by clearly stating that he's against cross-sex hormones for minors and the mutilation of children. He talks about that at length. It's good that he's willing to use the phrase mutilation of children. He's not moderating his language to pacify people. And he also is referencing how parents need to be involved in care decisions for their children, which is, of course, 100% true. Now then, Megyn Kelly throws him a bit of a curveball question because it's a little bit more philosophical than politicians are used to having to deal with. Can a man become a woman? And Donald Trump, I've now watched his answer 4 times, and it is, after a while, I realized that he is saying no, a man cannot become a woman. But it takes him a while to get there, doesn't it?
He hesitates.
Yeah, he hesitates. And so I think it's concerning for me, and I think for many people, that he hesitated. So I don't have a ton to say here. We are really grateful for his strong stance on minors not being mutilated, on even pushing for a ban at the national level of transgender surgery and hormone treatment for minors. And he said that before. And so it's great. We're grateful to see that he's sticking with that stance. And I hope that I'm not sure that every other Republican in the race is saying that. I'd like to know if Chris Christie and Nikki Haley are saying that. I hope they are. And I hope the other candidates are too. So one pundit, kind of an anti-Trump pundit, said, if someone has been president and is not able to say that a man cannot become a woman, then he should never be president again. So that's one take on this. I guess I'm a little bit more favorable to Trump on this. I think that it's a little bit garbled, but he gets there in the end and he says, no, a man cannot become a woman, even though he refers to the fact that our opponents on this issue are trying to create a fake, made-up situation in which a so-called man can give birth through some sort of strange Frankenstein experiment that I don't really want to talk about more on this podcast, but there are these attempts being made, right? We've all seen the headlines, pregnant man. That was like 10 years ago. So, in fact, that was a woman with a beard that was on the cover of Time magazine with a baby bump. But that was a lot of water under the bridge in the river of the culture wars since then. So, bottom line, Grace, I'm grateful for Trump's stance on transgender surgery for minors being banned. I wish he was more firm about the bathrooms thing, which was also mentioned earlier in this clip. So you can go check out that full interview with Megyn Kelly, and on the idea of men becoming women. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that on a lot of things, President Trump is pretty logical. You might laugh because there are some things in which he isn't very logical on, but on the facts, he's pretty straightforward, and that's something that I think is really in his favor on this issue. I mean, what we really saw in this clip is President Trump laughing and just thinking how absurd it is for a man to become a woman. He kind of laughed and said, yeah, well, there will be people who will be trying to change that, ha. But, his kind of whole attitude towards it is, this is just silly. I mean, it's silly. A man is a woman is a woman. Now, do I wish that he had more concisely, more clearly stated that? Absolutely. I think there's a lot of room for him to tighten up his argument, tighten up his comments. But I think that he, even that question kind of threw him off because he thought, oh, of course, a man can't become a woman. But he didn't fully come out and say that. And so I think that, he could tighten it up, but I'm less concerned on him with gender than I am with him on abortion. And I think primarily that's because, we've always known President Trump supports gay marriage. We've always known that, that's just part of his identity. That's just part of who he is as a politician. So we expect him to be a little bit more favorable on the gender issue. And then, he's been stated, many media outlets, pro-life media outlets have called him a pro-life champion. And he did indeed get Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court that helped to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's awesome. And so we expect him to be more of this pro-life champion. He was the very first president to attend a March for Life, which was amazing. So for him then to not promise to commit to some sort of federal ban is pretty disheartening. So on gender, there's room for improvement. I do appreciate his stance on women in military and, keeping men out of women's only spaces, such as locker rooms, such as sports. I think that's good. And of course, he's strongly against cross-sex hormones for minors. That's awesome. But I think, if he does end up getting the nomination and becomes president again, we're just going to need to surround him with some amazing advisors, some really good people in the White House that can advise him logically to really take the moral high ground on both of these issues because, he doesn't listen to many people, but when he's surrounded by a lot of wise people who are urging him in one way, that could really sway things. So overall, I think, Moses, you had some great comments there. We will have the videos linked below for you guys to check them out in full detail. Moses, will you go ahead and close us out with our verse for the week?
Sure. So this week, I want to read from Amos chapter 9. This is the final verses of the book of Amos, which is, I'll read it and then we'll discuss. In that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and will rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, who will do these things. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman, and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I've given them, says the Lord your God. And that was verses 11 through 15 of chapter 9 of Amos. So Amos is hard reading. If you read through the book, it's chapter on chapter of judgment. sort of judgment passages that read like the opposite of what's going on here. There being sin in the land, and the Lord casting Israel and casting Judah out of the land. But in chapter 9, we see this gorgeous, incredibly hopeful portrait of what will happen after. David's fallen shelter, the temple and the city of Jerusalem, the broken walls, the restored ruins, and it will be rebuilt as it used to be. And so that is just this picture that when there are ruins, when human culture comes to the end of itself, God is the one who comes in and raises us up and restores our ruins. And my absolute favorite piece here, one of my favorite images in the whole Bible, is verse 13, the reaper being overtaken by the plowman. What does that mean? That means that the reaper is sowing the seeds, and the seeds are growing so quickly into mature fruit that the ground has to be that the ground has to be plowed and and harvested. So this incredible picture of fruitfulness, which is then reinforced. The planter is the planter of the grape seeds is, and we actually, if you know anything about growing wine grapes or grapes of any kind, it takes a while. It takes a while for those vines to grow and be productive, like more than one season. And yet the one treading those finished grapes that are ripe, ready to be harvested, will overtake the planter. It's just like this incredible image of the fruitfulness that God will bring back to us. And maybe this is what ties together what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast with Minnesota's workforce and the unfortunate issues facing it, with the culture war things and President Trump's statements and everything else. And all of those things, whether it's what are the fall of our culture into some form of perdition, and also the general decline of our state that we see around us, we can have hope in God. And in fact, we must place our hope in God, because there is no hope anywhere else. And when we place our hope in God, then we are clinging to the promises that we see in Amos, that God will restore the ruins, that He will make for us a garden like we see in Eden, a new Eden. And that's what we see in Revelation. So it's in the beginning of the Bible, it's in the middle of the Bible here in Amos, and of course it's in the end of the Bible in Revelation. So that is that's my take on those verses from Amos. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Family Beacon. We are so grateful that you were here to hear us talk about these things. And coming in next week, we are always looking and trying to bring you guys the stories that not necessarily everyone's talking about, the stories that you need to know so that you can get the facts and stand for truth. Thanks so much for watching or listening.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you're up to date on life, family, and religious freedom. You can follow us on Instagram at MN Family Council and subscribe to us on YouTube to watch our content. Get the facts, stand for truth.